Before I start, I think I would like to just share a case that we're dealing with. I know this is a very sensitive topic and it is a meaningful one. And why do our children feel like dying or want to die is a very strange kind of a concept, right? So I want to try and make this as brief and as meaningful for all of you. And I don't know what's happening in our city or our country right now, but there are multiple aspects and multiple children going through what they do. And like I said, before I start, I just want to share a case with you that we've been working with at the center. So this is your typical 16-year-old child who came to us, of course, brought in by his father. And the father kept saying he needs counseling. So he needed some help. He was reticent. He was a bit shy. He would go through, periods of anxiety sometimes. And the father also expressed that he was not confident about himself. Now, when we met this child, he was this amazing kid, right? Like most kids are. He was bright. He was this typical A-star student. He was termed as head boy material. Of course, his mother had passed away when he was in grade 9 after she battled cancer for about 2-3 years of her life. And the father also expressed that he was very different. So when I asked him how he was different, he said he's just not your typical boy. And the father came across as being, orthodox, had very rigid rules and viewpoints to certain aspects of culture and religion and so on and so forth. And I expressed to Dad that the child was not okay and he needed counseling and therapy and perhaps more workup, right? And that's it, never came back for sessions. And I actually called the father 3-4 times myself, asking whether he was to come in for any appointments. Dad said he's busy with his exams and how academics always kind of takes over mental health especially. After about 3 months, I get a call that, like an urgent emergency phone call saying that, we need to rush him to the hospital because in the morning he tried to wake his son up for an exam in school and he was non-responsive. Of course, taken to Breach Candy Hospital, he was in the ICU for almost 3 weeks. He had swallowed about 25 to 30 benzodiazepine group of tablets, and basically he had attempted suicide. Luckily, he did survive through this ordeal, and I was one of the first few consultants to actually see him when he came around, and he was conscious enough to express himself and talk. And he actually broke down and cried and asked me why he was alive, right? He didn't want to live. And as, of course, through therapy sessions, of course, then naturally the father kind of woke up and realized that the child needed intervention. And we did. And this kid was obviously going through clinical depression because he was hospitalized, right? I mean, you do a full examination. We found about 40 to 50 scars on his upper thigh with self-harm. Self-harm is also a very common kind of a condition with teenagers and youth today. So he was going through so much of distress, obviously, that rather than seeking help out, he was, causing harm to himself physically to take away the so-called mental pain that he was going through. And of course, all your typical warning signs of clinical depression and suicidal thoughts, and all because he had a sexual identity problem, right? So he, I think, in time realized that he was perhaps homosexual. His favorite person in the world, like he described, was his mom, who was no more. He said his dad was emotionally not available for him and was so orthodox that he could not ever relate to him, and was mortally frightened that the day Dad ever found out that he was perhaps, confused about his sexual orientation, he didn't know whether he would ever be accepted or not, and therefore took these drastic steps. So this brings us to why suicide, what are the warning signs, and that's what I'm going to run you through with. Is the slide changing? Yeah? Okay, perfect. So as you can see, 1 in 10 people today are affected by mental health issues, but when you look at children, statistics world over show that 1 in 5 children show signs of a mental health condition, right? One cannot imagine a child, especially a pre-adolescent one, thinking about death, leave alone committing suicide. We would assume that a child may not have completely developed mature cognitive or abstract thinking levels to appreciate the finality of death, but they really do. And children too can have profound sadness and even want to kill themselves or sometimes even harm themselves. Well, these are the latest statistics that show that 20% of adolescents experience a mental health problem, and 10% of children and teenagers between the ages of 16 and 14 years of age have a medically diagnosed mental health problem or a condition. Suicide is the third leading cause of death amongst young adults worldwide after road injuries and respiratory tract infections. 1 million people die by suicide every year, and 1 million into 20 people attempt suicide every year. What is interesting, when we were going through Indian statistics and research, especially in 2016, we realized that suicide was the most common cause of death in the age group between 15 and 29 years of age in India. And what is even more scarier to learn and know is that 80 to 90% of suicide victims in teenagers and adolescents are educated and literate and usually have a high intellect. Imagine this, one person dies by suicide every 40 seconds, and as we speak, one suicide attempt every 3 seconds. And according to the WHO, for every 1 million suicides, 20 times more people attempt suicide. What's amazing among adolescents and children, one assumes that all children and adolescents who have suicidal thoughts or attempt suicide have either depression or anxiety, right? But look how small that percentage is, right? They say only 8% of people who attempt suicide have depression or a clinically diagnosed anxiety disorder. The remaining have other multiple aspects or issues which cause them to create this. These are even scarier stats. There's one psychiatrist for every 3 lakh Indians and one psychologist for every 12 lakh Indians. And out of 15 crore Indians that suffer from mental health illnesses, 1 crore of them are students. And in spite of this, they say only half of these students receive the required professional help. So when you look at the causes, right, there are so many factors that we go through, and some of the psychodynamic factors as we look at, right? So when you ask children and you ask teenagers, what you go through in your mind, why do you feel a certain way? These were some of the commonest things teenagers would relate to us. One was feeling that there was a complete loss of meaning to life or any purpose to life. There's always a profound state of pessimism or nihilism, right? A state of actual nothingness. A lot of teenagers today, right, have extremely kind of unhealthy coping mechanisms, and we realize that children and adolescents who go through this have no inner strength, which is called as resilience, to kind of overcome certain stressful times in life. Of course, complete breakdown of self, that means self-confidence, self-esteem, self-worth, and assuming that there is no other option other than to die. So teenagers actually feel when they take these steps that there is really no other outcome or option to deal with what's going on in life. And the last aspect is interesting, right? Because, the most commonest thing people ask, so what is the difference between psychiatry and psychology? Or when do you need psychiatric help and when do you need psychological help, right? So that comes to this point, like how you have hormones in your body, right? There are certain neurochemicals in our brain, and the most widely researched and studied ones are dopamine, which controls thoughts in the brain, and serotonin, which basically controls all our emotions in the brain, right? Now they say that sometimes for no apparent reason at all, you may have a neurochemical imbalance in the brain, right? So it's like going for a regular blood test and finding out that you have high blood sugar levels or diabetes, or you have a high cholesterol level, sometimes with no real symptomology as well. In the same way, you can have a perfectly normal, functional child and adolescent who in a week's time or 2 weeks' time kind of breaks down into something called as clinical depression, which is then a neurochemical kind of imbalance. It's a clinical condition which actually requires medical intervention, sometimes through medication, to kind of treat these symptoms. So that's the difference, right? So when you have a clinically diagnosed neurochemical imbalance which causes your clinical anxiety, panic attacks, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or sometimes even clinical depression, you need sometimes medication that acts on these chemicals in the brain to kind of balance them out. Of course, if it's a psychological issue or some family stress and other such predisposing factors or causes, you need intervention through counseling, therapy, and family work. So when you look at predisposing factors, right? So typically when you look at young adults or teenagers, sorry, the slide is not moving. There. So when you look at the predisposing factors, some of the most commonest ones are these: when there is sometimes severe trauma, abuse that the child has gone through, and this is such a high incidence, right? I mean, it's funny, but when we sometimes counsel, young children and sometimes even teenagers, literally every week at the center or in our private work, we have a history of a child who talks about sexually inappropriate behaviors that they've experienced, right? So it may not be a rape or a sexual abuse, but I'm just talking of sexually inappropriate behavior that they've perhaps been exposed to. Sometimes hostile living conditions at home, family problems, right? Today there's such a high incidence of family problems that can percolate these symptoms in children. Loss of a parent, either through abandonment or death. An interesting study recently done in the US suggested that children who lose their parents around 9 or 10 years of age have a 80 to 90% incidence of clinical depression arising in their young teenage life. Of course, mental health conditions, like I just said, so obviously when you have a clinically diagnosed condition, it predisposes you to suicide or suicidal ideations. Distress sometimes because of chronic illnesses, right? So you have long-standing conditions in children with cancer, paralysis, or such other kind of debilitating conditions which can predispose teenagers to the same. Academic-related issues, right? I mean, you hear of so many children in grade 10 or grade 12 who are attempting to take their lives after an exam failure or learning disabilities, right? I mean, the studies are showing in our own city that 15 to 25% of all school-going children in classrooms today have a diagnosed learning disability like dyslexia, dysgraphia, or even ADHD. And these also have shown to be high predisposing factors for children to feel the way they do. Bullying, ragging, sexual identity concerns like the first case I brought up with, right? Imagine right now I'm counseling and working, my whole team is with a 6.5-year-old child who has refused to go to school for a month and a half. And guess why? Because she's dark-skinned. She's been told that you're so black and ugly, why don't you go home and die? She was asked by her classmates whether she had rubbed her face in the garbage bin and come to school. And just imagine, 6.5, where are these kids? Where do they get off by being so mean, and where do they pick these things up from, right? So one needs to really introspect and wonder where and why children, even at age 6 and 7, can turn to be so nasty to their own peers in a classroom. Genetic factors, right? That's a huge cause. I mean, typically when you look at a history, like in this first case that I brought up, the father's own father suffered from clinical depression. So when you have a case history and you ask and you actually get into the history taking of a family, you always ask for a family history of a mental health concern. This is a very interesting slide for me because one wonders why teenagers behave the way they do. Why are they so impulsive? Why are they so irrational? Why do they have impulse discontrol? Why do they have delayed gratification? Now, this is so interesting to know. The most important part of the brain that develops is what the slide is showing you is called the prefrontal cortex, right? So if you look at if I were to create a fist, the outer covering of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, is responsible for all cognitive or thinking functions, right? So it's responsible for the teenager or a young adult to think abstractly, analytically, have a moderation to correct behavior. So it's like the conscience of the mind, so to speak. But now imagine it is the last part of the brain to completely and fully develop. And years back, they always thought that it was 18 or 20 years of age. That's why, legally you have 21 as that age cutoff for being a young adult. It is now considered to be 25. 25. And the first part of the brain to develop, right from birth onwards, is the innermost core part of the brain called the limbic system, right? So here it's like the seat of emotions. So your motivation, your drive, your feelings of pleasure, all this arises from the limbic system of the brain. And this is, like I said, the first to develop right after birth. All teenagers and children basically regulate themselves and their emotions from this part of the brain. That's why you wonder why teenagers are so, they rely, they have symptoms like anger outbursts, they're moody, they're irritable all the time, they have mood swings, they're highly impulsive, they misread others' intentions, and of course they have very, very poor emotional regulation sometimes. And of course the prefrontal cortex use less, far less as compared to the limbic system at this stage of their lives. So now you have an answer clinically as to why teenagers are the way they are. So what are your red flags when we look at teenagers, right? So, years back when I was in college, when I was studying at Jai Hind College through science, we had a really cool best friend of ours in our group. He was again a really cool dude, as we put it. He was one of the most popular kids we knew. And one fine day, of course, we get a call that he used to go on his terrace for a walk every evening. And he one day took out his tennis shoes, he placed them down, he stood on the ledge, I believe, for almost 5 minutes because there were other residents from the other building who realized that he was standing on that ledge, and he finally jumped. On his funeral, of course, we were teenagers ourselves then, right? We didn't have any understanding of mental health or what concerns these were. But all of us, when we met, we realized that he had planned it for over 2.5 weeks. He had met all of us. He had, those days we had music CDs and DVDs, so he actually called me a week back to return the CDs he had borrowed from me, and apparently had done that to all 9 of us in the group. He had met each of us in a way to kind of close and collect himself in life and give back things that he had even borrowed, right? So when you look at teenagers and these red flags, it's sometimes changes in behavior which are not in keeping with a teenager's personality, sometimes seemingly preoccupied with death. So there are so many school teachers who pick up, sometimes kids have to write essays and compositions, etc. They highlight to us that the content of what the child has written has been extremely dark or has a suicidal trend to it or certain thoughts of death or dark things that they've written. Withdrawal. So many teenagers, one of the red flags is just withdrawing from friends, from society, being more quiet, or not going for their usual outings or their games or their hobbies or their sport. Like I mentioned, preparing for death. So sometimes writing to themselves in the diary, journalizing, or like I said, manifesting in their written skills in school essays and competitions. Sometimes it's high-risk behaviors, like the first kid I told you who had self-harm. Now, many people feel that cutting yourself or self-harm in teenagers is just a cry for attention, but unfortunately, it's not always the same. It has to be taken into cognizance that this could be one of the precursor red flags for suicide. And of course, the last point is actually scary. It's seemingly at peace after a depressive phase. So teenagers who actually make it, like the same boy who I counseled, said that when he had made up his mind, he actually went through a peaceful phase knowing that there was finality to the act that he was going to take. So even as clinicians, we are trained that when we're treating a teenager or a young adult who's going through depression and he's seemingly absolutely suddenly fine or at peace, that could be a dangerous sign. So keep probing into his thoughts and understanding whether he's getting suicidal ideations in a more stronger way. Of course, depression, right? So when children and teenagers go through it, the signs are a bit different from what adults experience. So one is very clearly, like, I want you to keep thinking of this 16-year-old boy I first spoke about, right? So, like I said, his father, when he eventually explained to us what he was witnessing in his child, he was going through every sign and symptom of clinical depression. So there was low self-confidence, low self-esteem, a lot of negative thoughts and pessimism, persistent sadness of mood, and irritability. Sometimes in children, they say when there are clinical signs of depression, it's not really sadness of mood as much as mood swings and anger outbursts or irritability that is the main symptom that they see. Lack and loss of interest in almost everything, right? So all your previously enjoyed activities, it could be watching Netflix shows, going out with friends, meeting a few people, socially, all that seems to come down. Changes in appetite, sleeping patterns. So either excess eating or over appetite or diminished appetite and eating or excess sleeping or lack of it. Of course, in schools, one claims that there's a lack of even activity in terms of attention spans, concentration levels, and focus. Like I said, anger, rage, mood swings, somatic symptoms, right? This is very, very high in terms of understanding clinical work because these are teenagers who sometimes keep expressing that my head is hurting, my back is hurting, I'm feeling sick all the time. So many times in our clinical work, we pick up depressive symptoms only based on a doctor's referral. So a kid has perhaps gone through multiple blood tests and gone from one GP to another or one pediatrician to another for various physical symptoms which have no medical cause, and finally they refer the case to us as mental health professionals and we find out that these are just somatic symptoms which have an underlying depression or depressive symptoms. Even changes in activity levels, right? So either restlessness or sometimes lethargy. Like I said, recurrent thoughts of death or actual suicidal ideations and sometimes even poor self-care or hygiene. This is the most tragic part, right? So families, when we look at, one can't even imagine, right? In fact, some of the hardest work that we have to do is dealing with the families that go through this tremendous loss. And I think suicide is the worst form of death to come to terms with for families and loved ones, especially the ones who survive. There is tremendous guilt, humiliation, non-acceptance, disbelief, hurt, and anger that takes a huge toll on these individuals as there may be no real answers and no closure for this passing away. And this is the commonest feeling of frustration and anxiety that parents get or loved ones get that, I didn't see this happening and, why couldn't I have prevented it, right? So the guilt is what really, really kind of needs to be dealt with. And I think every family member who goes through something like this needs psychological intervention themselves. And of course, marriages, right? You look at the statistics, just imagine how many marriages don't survive after their children are lost to suicide. Anyone? 80%. 80 to 90% of marriages either go through severe marital disharmony or end up in a separation or divorce after their children have taken their lives. So this is an interesting slide. This is where, you guys come in. So we look at a mental health spectrum, right? So when I look at mental health, it's not only depression and suicide, right? There's so much more to it. And I truly believe that mental health is actually emotional intelligence, right? So how we think, how we feel, how we react to stress. Today, if I were to ask all of you that how many of you have gone through challenging times in life or felt stressed or felt hurt by a loved one or felt betrayed by someone, or was going through awful stress in their workspace, or facing politics somewhere in their life. How many of you feel like that? All of us, right? So all of us doesn't necessarily mean you have a mental health condition, but that or this all is mental health. So when you look at that spectrum of mental health, it's wellness at one end and of course an illness at the other. So when you look at intervention or reach to another human being or a child or a teenager, it's exactly the point when you feel things are not okay, right? When you feel things are not okay and before you break down into something psychological or clinical. So when you look at mental health first aid, right, we've all heard about physical first aid. In fact, so many of us have gone through training in our schools, right, when we go through school life, but there is no regard for mental health. So actually our biggest mission right now is to go to every school and train every teacher and school principal in mental health first aid, right? So when you look at mental health first aid, it's the help provided to a person either developing a mental health problem, experiencing a worsening of a mental health condition, or someone who is undergoing a mental health crisis. And the first aid is given until appropriate professional treatment is received or until the crisis is resolved. You know, I want to bring up a point here which was interesting in our training. When, years back, of course, when you were trained, we actually had this misconception that when you thought a child, a teenager, or a young adult was feeling suicidal, we were told not to address it directly. Do you know why, anyone? Why would you think that you were not meant to ask directly about suicide to someone going through feelings of not feeling okay? Because the misconception was you're putting ideas into the young person's mind. So even if the person is not feeling something, if you ask him directly about suicide, you're perhaps giving him the wrong kind of ideations that, okay, that is perhaps one of the things you could do to cope with your stress. But the worldwide statistics show that the minute you feel, even with a loved one, even you as individuals who are not mental health professionals, it is okay to actually directly ask them that if you're not feeling okay, do you have thoughts or feelings that you want to harm yourself, hurt yourself, or sometimes even perhaps take your own life? So this approach may empower young people to at least seek help, or the main thing is to talk. When you look at teenagers today, like this child I spoke about in the first case, he felt there was no one to talk. He asked me, he said, who would I have talked to? And my first question to him was, when I met you the first time, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you even try or give that, aspect? So you have to understand, even with teenagers and even with us, there's such a lot of stigma against or with mental health, right? I mean, how many of you have gone to see a dentist? Great. How many of you visited an orthopedic surgeon when you've had some bone injury or a fracture or a sprain? Great. But all of you said in this room that you've gone through some mental health concern, right? Whether it's stress, whether it's feeling emotionally down sometimes or going through some emotional issues, or with our own children, right? So kids, or as us as parents, when we have our kids who are having a really bad time in school, either with their academics or being bullied or feeling not okay with certain peer pressure, how many of us actually seek mental health professional services? Very, very few, right? But of course, I'm seeing changes with that, so that's a good thing. But like I said, the typical thing is, once you go to see a psychiatrist, the first thing that even intelligent, educated people say is, but we are not mad, or we don't have a psychotic problem, or we are not mental enough to seek professional help. These are really, really odd misconceptions that need to be changed. Another misconception is that once you go to a mental health professional, you'll be put on medications. You'll have to take the medications all your life. The medications cause weight gain and addiction and etc., etc. So that's another huge reason why even parents of children and teenagers don't seek professional help when they really need to. So the importance is that understanding and empathy are the best ways to approach a suicidal child or teenager and assist in helping them through this dark phase. It is imperative to ensure that they seek professional help with the assistance of their family by a clinical or counseling psychologist or sometimes a child psychiatrist. We all need to put aside our shame, our bias, our judgment, and preconceived notions in order to proactively just sometimes save our life. And one needs to do this so that there is never a feeling of doubt and regret that we could have or we should have done something about this. So like I started off saying, right, this father, the minute this happened to his son, I cannot tell you, there were 2 or 3 sessions where he could not even speak. He was just sitting there sobbing, sobbing, and sobbing. He was not even being able to bring himself to get to speak because of that severe regret that you feel as a parent. And of course, the typical misconceptions, even as parents, it's a phase. It will pass. Or sometimes we're like ostriches with our head dug under the sand saying that this can't happen to us or this can't happen to my child. Or what's the big deal? Sometimes even as parents, we pass such invalidating comments, right? So another thing, like teenage relationships, right, which is a big cause for teenagers who sometimes even attempt suicide impulsively. I mean, when a kid has gone and told their parents that, mom, I'm having relationship problems, or I'm having a fight with my boyfriend or girlfriend, or they've come home really distressed over 3-4 days because they've had a breakup, parents actually make fun of these kids of theirs. And I know so because they come and tell me in therapy sessions that my parents will never understand the pain I'm going through. And again, research and studies have shown that because the brain is so underdeveloped, like you saw on those slides, how an adult feels during marital strife or a marital breakup or ending in a separation and a divorce is equally as much as a teenager feels when they go through their first little hiccups in their love life or a breakup. So you have to understand that the feelings that they go through are absolutely real. So like comments like, what's the big deal? Like I said, it's a phase. Uh, how can you be so selfish is another very sad but common thing even psychologists tell teenagers. So when teenagers actually express in therapy to some counselors that they feel like ending their lives, apparently the first comment some counselors put forth to that teenager is, how can you think like that? How can you be so selfish? How can you think only about yourself? What will your parents feel? What will your family think? And what will happen to your family after this, right? Teenagers don't want to hear that. They want to feel validated. So whenever and however they speak or open up even to you as adults, you cannot pass judgmental comments or criticize them in any way. Your body language, your tone of voice, the way you approach them, the way you sit next to them to comfort them, the openness that you share with them, or sometimes even sharing about yourself sometimes to allow them to feel that they can feel comfortable enough to express themselves, has to be done in a mindful way. And I love this. It was a saying by Carl Jung, who was the founder of analytical psychology. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. And I think that's for all of us, right? I mean, it's not just a meaningful 4 lines for us as psychiatrists or professionals. It is, I think, each of us have a responsibility in our society to bring forth more awareness about mental health, to remove the stigma that shrouds all of us as individuals, and seek help when we need to. It is not okay to not seek help. So I hope that in time, it could be a loved one, it could be a friend's child, it could be someone in your family, it could be anyone, right? So there's no harm in approaching, asking direct questions sometimes, just so that at least, if nothing else, a teenager knows that you care and that you're there for them. Thank you so much.
So, sir, as you said, like there's a stigma around like parents relating to the topic of suicide, and also as a teenager, what do you think? Like, and even helplines today, helpline numbers, they don't like suicide helpline numbers. They don't generally pick up when probably the time is, and even research has shown that. So, what option do you think the teenager has during such times? If a parent has a stigma of like even going to a counselor today.
So that's a good question. So what we tell all teenagers too, we do this in schools, we do this in colleges when we talk to you all, that you have the legally right age to seek help. So I understand, and I'm a kind of a bit of an old-fashioned therapist. I don't believe in online counseling or Skypes, etc. But of course, sometimes when there is a need, that could be a possibility too. But sitting face to face with someone and engaging as a human being, because I think we're all living in this crazy world of social media, screen time, and I think I've had it with that. It's, you rather sit across another human being and share certain thoughts and feelings, at least to know what is going on, because none of us, when we go through certain aspects of mental health, even sometimes know that it could be something clinical. So that's why, and I'm a firm believer, even in the medical sciences, the earlier you intervene, the better the prognosis, right? So even with mental health, if you intervene early on time and you realize that something is not okay, the prognosis, the rehabilitation process, and the treatment outcomes are far, far superior. So even you have the right of confidentiality, even sometimes without your parents knowing that you've sought help. But of course, in therapy, when a teenager comes in, a lot of our work actually goes into making the teenager more cognizant about these issues so that they have the confidence in sharing this with their with their parents, and then that's how we eventually rope in the family. And I'm also a strong believer that with children and teenagers, having our parental support, sometimes sessions with our own mothers or fathers, and family work can be extremely beneficial. Another thing we do with schools right now is we are bringing mental health into the school curriculum. And I think that's fabulous, right? Because when we have talks, so what I've done in the school that we run, every week, so I've actually joked with principals of these very strict old-fashioned schools that it's okay to have one less geography class or one less history class or one less math class, but once a week have a class for mental health. Now, when I'm saying mental health, I don't mean talking about only the clinical stuff, but emotional quotients, the aspects of kindness. So she asked me that, okay, if I have grades 1, 2, and 3 also involved in mental health talks, how do I train such a young child about mental health? But like I said, mental health starts, like I talked about this 6.5-year-old, right? So talking about discrimination, skin color, religious tolerance, just being kind, what is the meaning of empathy? Today, there are so many young children, I'm talking of kids, say, even between the ages of 6 and 12, they've never heard the word empathy before, leave alone the meaning of it, right? So we are trying to instill this into schools. So what we've also realized with these few schools, when we've done that, the awareness builds up and the confidence to seek help goes up. So from perhaps few children, shying away from, say, seeking help, or today, some of you know that going to a counselor, if the school counselors call you into their room, it's like a shameful thing or an embarrassing thing. And after these courses or these talks, we've realized that the number of kids increased by over 70%. 70% of school kids and college kids approached their school counselor or mental health professionals because it was so openly talked about to bring about more awareness and cognizance of mental health.
Hello. Emotions cloud judgment.
I can't.
Emotions, they cloud a judgment. It's usually impulses that take control over you. Sometimes the impulse is too strong. So how do you handle these impulses?
You're talking.
Impulsivity. See, emotions cloud your judgment. Sometimes the impulses are too strong. So how do you control these impulses?
Right.
In the normal day life, for example.
Sure. So basically, I tell all teenagers and young adults there's something called as a TFR train. Now, if you think about all our emotions and feelings, where do they come from? Always a thought, right? So everything, remember, starts with a thought. Every thought leads to a feeling or an emotion, and then all those emotions and feelings lead to a certain reaction. So for example, it's funny, but say your mother-in-law has really chewed up your brains in the morning, and your poor husband's come back after a long day at work, and you've just attacked your husband as a reaction, right? So, but no one really goes back in understanding where the thought or the emotion has started from. So we actually do a lot of training. So there's a very interesting concept called metacognition. Does anyone know what metacognition is? It's basically a very simple tool which teaches us to think about our thoughts. Now, if you notice with life, I tell all individuals only two things cause us stress. Only two. One is a situation in life that we sometimes may not have control of, be it the traffic on the roads or Mumbai's beautiful upgrading and so on and so forth, or a situation at home or with a friend or a family member or sometimes situations at work. The second thing that causes us the most stress and grief is, anyone? Human beings. Relationships, right? I mean, a lot of stress and grief and mental health concerns are based on human interactions and relationships, right? Now, sometimes in life, you end up banging your head on the wall and you can't change that given situation, or you can't change that specific person who's causing you that grief. But what can you change? The thoughts behind. You have to ask yourself. So metacognition actually trains you in therapy to kind of think about why you're so stressed. Why am I so stressed? Is this person that important enough to cause me so much of grief? I've had a fight with my girlfriend. Do I need to go and smoke 5 marijuana joints to release that stress? Or if I'm going through family problems, do I need to go into the bathroom and take a blade and cut myself? Are these situations and human beings or relationships that important? Of course, these are just examples I'm giving you about how metacognition works. So to answer your question is that we all act on a knee-jerk response, right? We get a thought, we've not even realized that that thought exists, but we are only dealing with our emotions and our feelings by reacting. So one has to sometimes just step aside, detach yourself from that person or that situation and start thinking about your thoughts and analyzing them and questioning them. And that itself works. It's like the 10-second rule, right? We teach and train corporates also that say when you're troubleshooting or you're writing a really nasty text message to your friend who you're upset or angry with. We've all done that, right? We've texted something. You read that same text message sometimes after half an hour, how do you feel? Like, oh shit, what have I written? This sounds so petty, this sounds so childish, right? But we've done it out of high impulse, high feelings of emotions, and it's done. Now, if you controlled yourself with that simple text message and decided to write something after 2 hours or the next day, you can actually have time to think. You can still say the same things, but with an attenuated choice of words, a different tone, but still getting your message across.
Hello. So seeking psychiatric help is still considered a taboo in our society. What could be a potential trigger point where we should find that this cannot be solved at home and we actually need to go out and take formal help?
I didn't understand your question, sorry.
The question was, if somebody is in a psychiatric problem, what could be a potential trigger point where we should feel that this cannot be resolved at home by parents and friends, and one need to actually go and take formal help from a mental health provider?
Okay, right. So, yeah, that's a good question actually, because like I said, you don't know when you need help, right, sometimes. So, like I say, that's, okay, supposing one has fever, right? Now, all of us use, paracetamol, crocin, combiflams, or we take an antibiotic ourselves. In fact, I feel the worst thing we do to ourselves is self-medicate, right? And we become our own doctors with a flu or a cold or a cough. Do you know medically how harmful self-medication is? Because we sometimes end up taking the wrong antibiotics. The most harmful way to kill yourself is not taking sleeping tablets. It is, anyone? It's paracetamol. So your typical crocins that we pop in at the drop of a hat or with a headache or with fever, because those cause long-term damage in your system. It can cause ulcers, you can bleed out to death, etc., and all your organs basically shut down with something just like that, right? Now, even in a medical condition, say something as simple as fever without any cough, cold, or some underlying infection, the first thing we ask, if it's not resolved in 2-3 days, is get a blood test. Why do we take a blood test? Because I firmly believe, again, diagnostics, right? So it's so important, even in a medical condition, to diagnose what you're treating. In the same way with mental health. So if you're not sure, or even if you researched, our best doctors are Googles, right? We all go on Google, and it's so scary because there are so many teenagers who come to me and say, I've come. So I ask them, so what brings you here? I think I have bipolar disorder, or I think I have clinical depression, or they've already done their reading and they've actually diagnosed themselves. And when I ask them how and why, they actually say that you have these amazing online questionnaires and symptom lists. If you read those symptom lists, then we all have a mental health disorder. All of us. Because if you read the symptom list of ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactive disorder, I think we all have a bit of it. If you read the clinical symptoms of depression, we've all gone through it. So as with anxiety, like today when I saw this hall, I think I got a slight of a panic attack because I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be speaking to so many people in this huge hall. So again, so over even schools. So, when we did this workshop last month also in a school on mental health, we got 5 referrals and the parents were horrified because the teacher in the note in the referral actually said referring this child 12 and a half for ADHD or bipolar disorder or depression. So now we've started training teachers that this is just a training, you're not meant to use labels. And I always joke also in my sessions with schools that labels are for jars, not for human beings. So you need to explain that even if you're not sure, seek the right professional help. So you don't have to actually go and see a psychiatrist. You have tons of counselors, psychologists, school counselors. There's no harm in approaching them and asking that this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm going through, or this is what's happening to my child. Do I need to seek further help or not?
Hi, sir. First of all, love the presentation. Very complex subjects, but broken down very simply. I'm a psychologist myself, and I wanted to ask you regarding this dilemma which I've been facing personally with the clients I see. I see this new culture in schools where children, very small children, are more and more mean to their friends. When we were back in school, we didn't hear the words which children today, 6, 7 years old, are talking to their peers, talking to their teachers. So it's a larger question. Perhaps you also don't have the answer to it, but can we intervene at different points, perhaps maybe via parents, maybe not directly through the children, but how can we inculcate and promote an environment where kindness, empathy, being a good human being is placed at a higher benchmark than scoring good in class? So do we intervene at a syllabic level? Of course, please take the question forward.
Super question. I love answering this question, which is most commonly asked. And this is one question where I throw back to parents. And if you look at all the nastiness that we see in schools, right? So, I work with a lot of schools. So comments, like I told you, the 6.5-year-old who was traumatized because she's dark-skinned. Oh, you've come out in not a branded t-shirt. So brands, what clothes you wear, which car you drive, or what size of home you live in, or the kind of birthday parties you throw. Sometimes when I have gone to some of my children's birthday parties, I'm like, is this a wedding or a birthday party, right? So I always joke back with this answer is that we need to start a school for parents, parenting school, right? Because I truly believe that these comments, there is no 6-year-old who can be so nasty innately, right? There's no child who's born really nasty or doesn't know what kindness and empathy means. So it starts from us, and it sometimes is not consciously. You have grandparents who even jokingly say, oh my God, you can't marry anyone excepting only a Hindu or a Muslim or a Parsi, depending on which religion or background or culture you come from. You have nasty comments about religion and tolerance. You have kids in class saying, yuck, don't sit next to me because you're having a chicken sandwich. And I keep joking with them that tomorrow when you're on flight, can you put your hand up and ask the stewardess to change your seat because the person or the passenger sitting next to you has ordered a non-vegetarian meal? So I really believe that so bringing in mental health into the curriculum is a huge step, and I think many, many schools are doing this. but a lot of parental work and student work. So we do this in fun ways. So we have workshops for younger kids where we do a mad ad series. So we look at certain products, like the funniest product that we actually bring to school is the Fair and Lovely cream. And we actually ask them to discuss why it's such an idiotic product. Why does the sound of it sound funny? And does that mean that you are lovely and beautiful only if you're fair? So when you bring meaningful, experiential ideas and thoughts, right, into a school, into a classroom, into parents' minds, that's when that tube light starts switching on, and I think a different meaning comes about. So a lot of parental work, I think, is the key to all of this, because I genuinely believe that sometimes the comments we pass as adults, I mean, we all do that. We sometimes abuse, we say stupid things. I mean, we have to realize that we are the ultimate role models for our kids. I mean, and there's genetic work happening as well, right? It's funny how crazily similar our kids are. I mean, imagine studies have shown that even posture, something as simple as posture in a child, is genetic. It's not created. So the genes are already there, but like I said, a lot of nature, it's a common complex theory of nature versus nurture. So if you put both in a 50-50% attribute, so genetic genes are already playing its role, but the nurturing part, so how we bring up our children, parenting skills, influences in school, with teachers. So even teacher training, because I had so many kids recently who stood up after my talk and said, but what if my teacher is like that? So we talked about bullying. It's so sad, but so many kids talked about teachers who were bullies to the kids and passed discriminatory comments to a child, who was diagnosed with a learning disorder. So even though the teacher knew that, she actually called this child dumb on 4 occasions and read out his English answer to the class, trying to explain to the other kids how an essay should not be written like this.
Thank you for your thoughts, wise thoughts. I'm reminded of this study done by Dr. Vikram Patel from London School of Tropical Medicine, who did a study in India. And he found that among the educated urban people, especially in South India, but then he did a larger study, the rate of suicide is very high. It's comparable to South Korea, China, which is among the highest in the world, South Korea. And this is young, educated people. And 2 causes which come to my mind, which the research talked about. Number 1 was the stress of examination competition in a society. Few jobs and so many young people competing for that. Second was problem of relationship, the second major cause. Not only just breakdown of relationship, but falling in love with the wrong caste person, so that the parents would be an obstacle in having a marriage or so on. So relationships and stress of competitions. Do you agree with that? And according to him, this study done by this group led by Dr. Vikram Patel, it is much more the emerging social and economic system which is leading to mental health problems. The problem of competition, of fewer jobs, unemployment, and social and cultural issues of orthodox parents and so on. Thank you.
Absolutely, you're right in that. So like I said, when you look at depression and suicide, they're like very small pockets. There are so much more that contributes to mental health and suicide, etc. So all your points were absolutely correct. Yes, relationships, but like again, coming back to parents, right? So when you look at kids who are stressed or who even actually hang themselves from a fan when they failed in an exam, 80 to 90% of the stress is parental created. So the expectations of kids are so high, and there's so much of pressure to make something of your life, and it's all about education. So like I said, we have to keep bringing down that awareness. Like schools, imagine we've gone to them and said, we are conducting free mental health workshops. And they have said, sorry, we have the IB exam going on right now, we have this, we have sports day, we have, we are literally shunned away from their doors. And we have to call back 20 times, and we keep pushing in free, 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 and it yet doesn't work. But having said that, there is a lot of more awareness. But another thing that you didn't mention, which is a point to bring up, especially since we're talking about youth, is social media, right? I mean, when you talk about, like right now, 10 years back in my practice, we barely saw self-harm. Remember I talked about it in my case examples. Every week I see a teenager who's experimented with self-harm. Now, where does that come from? Do you know there are active chat groups, social media groups that conglomerate together, that train and teach other children, especially young girls, how to harm themselves? They will actually tell you where to cut, what kind of pressure to use of the blade, how to sterilize those braids, how in which parts of the body to cut where you can conceal it. So like the upper thigh is the most common one, and the wrists over here, which you can cover with a sleeve. And the most intriguing part is that they actually believe these are healthy coping mechanisms. So the immaturity of, the emotional and the mental pain will get numb if you cut yourself. This is an easier way to escape from all the trauma you're going through emotionally with your relationship or your stress with your friends. I mean, the ingenious ideas, right? So one parent actually found out, and the girl was in therapy, and we had to obviously use safety strategies, hide all sharp objects, etc. From the chat group, when she actually shared that this is what's happened, there were 15 other children on that group who gave her a brilliant idea. Guess what the idea was? Find a school sharpener, unscrew the small tiny blade over there, and why don't you use that? So I feel social media also, sometimes in an unnatural way glorifies these aspects. And another aspect, since we're on the topic of suicide, is a concept called suicide contagium. Does anyone know what that is? It's like copycat suicides. So copycat murders, you've heard of that concept, right? So there are teenagers, because like I said, I showed you the slide of their brain, which is so underdeveloped in terms of logical thinking aspects, and they're so impulsive, that they actually sometimes hero worship kids who've either attempted suicide or who've vociferously spoken about it or have died by it. And there's a whole wave of then kids who are maybe close to that child or that family who actually start, thinking about this and actually contributing aspects towards self-harm. And that's another very dangerous aspect that builds up amongst youth and teenagers. And that's why when there is a suicide in a school or in society or amongst families, it is so important at that time to address it. So schools have to address it, have to talk about it, open up channels of communication regarding it, so that when kids do feel like this too, they have to understand that they are perhaps not the right feelings or the reactions to have. The genetic aspects. So if it's a clear-cut clinical condition, right? So sometimes you may have a kid or a teenager who has none of these emotional problems, no stress, no psychological issues, no emotional problems, no family problems, and yet they go through the slide that I showed you of clinical depression, then you clearly know it is clinical. So then you have to treat it with antidepressant medications that acts on the serotonin level of the brain and reduces the symptoms or takes the clinical syndrome away. And you have to understand that antidepressant medication is so safe that they're now even using it for kids as young as 6 and 7. So they are smart, new researched medication, not used 10 and 20 years back, which had a lot of side effects on youth, and they're not meant to ever be given lifelong. Please understand, when you have a clinical condition in mental health, the minimum treatment is 6 to 9 months. So it's a course that you have to complete, and the biggest fallout rates is when teenagers or youngsters are on treatment and they feel 100% better even after 3 months, they take it upon themselves to stop the medication. And then relapse rates are high. So when we counsel kids on their treatment path, we always tell them that the minimum course is a 6 to 9 month period. You complete the course, then we'll assess, and then the medication has to be weaned off. But there is not one teenager or child as of today who's ever been on medication or required it lifelong.
In adults, that person is penalized medico-legally. What happens to a survivor of a suicide offense in a child's case?
Yeah, so
He or she has gone through so much trauma, and then you have to go through courts and the legal aspect.
yeah, so again, they've decriminalized suicide and suicide attempts. So before, it used to be very traumatic. When I say before, quite recently too, till the new Mental Health Act and the decriminalization of suicide has taken place. Forget that, just a year back when we admitted again a 16-year-old, right, for a suicide attempt, the cops insisted in going into the ICU to take her statement. Now imagine how traumatic and shameful it is, and you're sitting there, you're anyways shattered with what has happened, you're going through medical procedures, and it's in a touch and go situation, and then to sit and give a sometimes 1 hour account of what happened when you're perhaps clueless as a parent is actually shameful, but it's genuinely changing, and it's actually stopped with all the legal recourse that we're going through. But to answer your question, that so the main thing that as family members and as friends, we have to get families to seek help. Because you have to understand, as a society, we too have loose tongues. So when we have a child who's taken his or her life, the first finger we point and the aspersions are on the parent, which is so unfair, because sometimes you could be the most amazing parents, hands-on and cognizant of your child, and yet, like I said, if a teenager or a young adult has sometimes decided to end their lives, even us as professionals may not know, or may not be, kind of have the mindset to understand what's going into their children. And that's why if you've noticed that actual suicide, right? Actual, when I'm saying when the person or the young adult has actually decided to end themselves or end their lives, there's no one to survive to tell us their story. Because they have planned it to the T to eventually end. So there is a dearth actually of studies, because when you look at the other cases that fortunately survived through medical intervention, they perhaps did not have the high intent to really end themselves, end their lives. It was more like a cry for help. They needed emotional help or psychological help at that time. So parents or loved ones of survivors need months of therapy to come to terms with this, and they need a lot of psycho-education to actually understand the concept of suicide and the psychodynamics of suicide. I'm sorry, but we have to end. But thank you for the engagement. I think it's been an awesome interaction. Thank you so much.